This season of What's Her Name is sponsored by the Women's History Initiative at the Utah Historical Society. Utah women's history is so much more than you think. history.utah.gov/women.
This episode is also brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Eric and Carolyn Shumway, Kim Hokinson, Bree Ames Smith, Robin Brown, Cornelia Weiss, Heather Justin, Janelise Cannon, Jamie Lang, Valerie Jacobson, Maria Carla Sanchez, Jill Harrigan, Heather McKinnon, Michaela Frew, Amanda Gilmore, Sarah Mikado, and Monique Harris-Pixado. You can help support the podcast for as little as $1 a month and help us make more episodes. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Olivia.
It is 1920. We are in Sapporo, Japan.
Oh.
And a 23-year-old former waitress is carefully packaging up short stories that she has written about her experiences working in a cafe. She is going to give them to a regular customer at the cafe, who also just happens to be the editor of a very popular magazine, in the hopes that he might consider publishing some of them. She's never written anything before, but he agrees to read them. They're a little bit spicy and a little bit scandalous.
Oh.
Kind of a peek inside the life of a not quite proper working woman.
Oh.
An unusual voice that he thinks might appeal to some of his more sheltered / privileged / bored readers.
Interesting.
And he agrees to publish them. Because, as everyone knows, breaking into literature is just that easy. The first time you send off anything, it gets published in a major magazine.
Of course, that's the norm.
But thus began the literary career of Uno Chiyo, renowned writer, magazine editor, fashion designer, domestic goddess, OG influencer, and all-around creator of beautiful things. She headed off to Tokyo to pick up her first ever writing paycheck and never returned to her job, her home, or the husband she had left behind in Sapporo.
Oh.
And launched herself into a brand new life.
Wow.
Of her own literal design.
Wow. Cool.
I'm Olivia Mickle.
And I'm Katie Nelson.
And this is What's Her Name?
Fascinating women you've never heard of.
My guest, and the person who introduced me to Uno Chiyo in the first place, is Dr. Rebecca Copeland.
My name is Rebecca Copeland, and I'm a professor of Japanese literature at Washington University in St. Louis. I've been there a long time and am now in what we call phased retirement. I'm no longer full-time and I'm no longer tenured, and I'm having a great time just focusing on teaching and my other writing projects.
She's also a fiction writer and a translator, and with Laura Miller, our guest for our episode on Queen Himiko, the author of Diva Nation, Female Icons from Japanese Cultural History.
Ah, good name.
So my career has been devoted almost exclusively to modern Japanese women writers and making sure that they are visible. I'm always happy to have a chance to talk about Japanese women writers and this particular woman writer. The family name is Uno. It sort of sounds like the Spanish Uno. And then her given name is Chiyo. So in Japanese, we tend to have the surname first and then the given name. So Uno Chiyo. In English style, it would be Chiyo Uno. But for me, that feels unnatural, so I always refer to her as Uno Chiyo.
Uno Chiyo was born in 1897, right as Japan is at the peak of their big push for modernization / westernization /
invade your neighbor's
imperialism
Or as I wrote in our History of the World in Lost Women, Japan decided if you can't beat them, join them. And joined in the imperial game.
Join them by beating them.
By invading all your neighbors and everybody around you in every possible way.
She was born in 1897 in Iwakuni, which is on the inland sea close to Hiroshima. Her father was the son of a sake brewer, the second son, though. And in that time period, all of the property would go to the first son, and he would become the head of the household. But the older son was infirm. And so there was a lot of expectation that the second son would take over. But he was a ne'er-do-well. He was a pampered boy, a very spoiled man, and would not take responsibility. So he was sort of shunted off to the side and given a monthly allowance, which he squandered on gambling and women. And he was not a very, nurturing father. And when her father died, everybody felt kind of liberated by his death, though they were sad, of course. Now they weren't under this sort of tyrant. And she kind of began then to explore her own liberty.
In many senses of that word. She has to get a job, first of all. They all have to get jobs.
And had to work because the family no longer received any kind of stipend from the father's older brother.
And at 18 years old, Chiyo becomes a school teacher.
Oh.
She is not a school teacher for long.
Uno fell in love with another school teacher, which was forbidden, and she kind of gets drummed out of town.
Nothing happens to him.
Of course.
Because, it's clearly the 18-year-old girl's fault.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, she makes her way to Tokyo and actually marries her cousin. And the cousin became a white-collar worker, like a banker or something very highbrow like that, and was sent to Sapporo. And Uno lasted up there for about one winter and decided she wanted to become a writer. She had seen writers in Tokyo. She had worked in a cafe and had seen writers come and go and thought, well, that's a really interesting kind of profession. I think I'd like to try that. And so she sent a copy of one of her early stories to one of the publishers that she had seen at the cafe, and he published it. She said he knew me from the cafe, and I suppose he thought the writings of a cafe waitress was more interesting than writing from a proper woman. And so she was able to sort of market her attractiveness and sort of her sexuality to get published. And she had no hesitation about that. That's what people wanted from her, was stories of sort of scandal.
Fascinating.
That's all they were going to accept from a woman writer would be either like domestic platitude or sexy scandal, right?
Yeah.
And one of the reasons it's hard to tell what's true, quote, and what's not is because of the genre she was writing in. She is mostly writing this very popular genre of the time called self-writing or the I novel. These are fictionalized memoirs. They're true. They are autobiographical. But also, it's understood things probably didn't happen the way you're seeing them on the page. And these were extremely popular in Japan at this point because they were seen as being more honest and more authentic than fiction.
There was a sense in early 20th century Japan that fiction was somehow suspect and inauthentic. And so if you wrote about your own life, there was a purity in that. You weren't making things up. So it was authentic because it was what you experienced. But nobody can write about their own life without rearranging facts. So these writers who were supposedly writing about their own lives very factually would delete scenes, they would add characters to get to the sort of purity of the emotion. And she was later to say, no writer is as lucky as a woman writer. As soon as she breaks up with a man, she can write about it without the slightest sense of shame.
So, while men might need to be chivalrous or careful about what they write, they need to protect their former lover's privacy, her honor, women don't have to worry about that because nothing that a woman is going to write about a man will actually harm or affect his life or reputation. The patriarchy is going to make sure that, just like, of course, the teacher in her first experience, it will have no impact on him. So she can say whatever she wants without having to worry about it at all.
Yeah.
And boy, does she. Every time her marriage ends, she immediately writes a novel about it.
This makes me think Taylor Swift. Break up with Taylor Swift, there will be songs.
Correct. And in fact,
Taylor Swift would like her.
Oh.
She was very aware of how she was viewed and that people weren't taking her seriously, right?
Yeah.
These are just like, ow, she's just writing sexy
like
novels.
Taylor Swift. Yeah.
And I would argue, like Taylor Swift, she is a serious writer.
Yeah.
Taylor Swift is a brilliant lyricist, and Uno Chiyo was a brilliant writer because of what she was doing.
They said, oh, she just goes out and has affairs and then writes about it. But that was, I feel, really a persona that she crafted for herself. In fact, she was a serious writer because she was willing to put her writing before anything else. And if you carefully look kind of behind the scenes of the scandal that she promotes, there's a vulnerability and a real humanity that we see in her works. And I think that's what many of her readers were attracted to.
If you look carefully between the lines of what she's doing, there is this amazing vulnerability and humanity. While the surface level of her novel says, woo, scandal, woo, sexy, what the readers are really responding to is, oh, you too? That's how I feel too.
Yeah.
I feel vulnerable and I feel cast aside, but I too want to just move on with my life. And that sort of is how her career began to unfold, that she focused on her writing and would marry men along the way. But the marriages would never really last longer than 5 years or so. Because I think for Uno, her writing was first. She would make a play of being wifely and work at domestic duties like cooking and being beautiful. But then, she would be bored with that and would have to focus on her writing.
And these men just couldn't cope with being second.
Mm.
And then they would look for a more submissive woman. And she would be cast aside. And so it went until just before the war, she marries a man who she then lives with for, 20 years or so, until their marriage just really disintegrates. What's interesting is, in a lot of her fiction, she creates two female characters. One is a wife and fairly dependent upon a man, and the other is the other woman. And both are invested with a deep, deep personality. And neither is treated as the winner. They're both important. And the man is sort of the weak link. You know, he can't make up his mind. He's torn between which woman should I go with. And I kind of like to think of the man as representing kind of Uno Chiyo's psychology. That she lived with this sort of bifurcation. Should I stay home and be this helpmeet to my man and find my fulfillment there because that does fulfill me? Or should I become the other woman and be sort of outside society because that also fulfills me? And so she was both. She bounced between these two different poles. She didn't feel that one was superior to the other. It's just that she couldn't be one all the time.
This season of What's Her Name is sponsored by the Utah Women's History Initiative at the Utah Historical Society.
The Women's History Initiative highlights Utah's dynamic history makers. 8 sovereign nations in Utah since time immemorial, pioneers, explorers, immigrants, entrepreneurs, visionaries, and dreamers who have made a home there ever since.
Join the Society to read the Utah Historical Quarterly, attend free virtual events, and get news about the Future Museum of Utah, opening in June 2026. In January 1910, the skilled chocolate makers at the McDonald Candy Company in Salt Lake City went on strike, demanding an 8-hour workday and a flat salary of $10 a week. The Chocolate Dippers Union No. 1 was the first women workers' union in Utah, and although their strike was unsuccessful, women wage workers would win a 9-hour workday from the Utah State Legislature just 1 year later. To see all of what the Utah Historical Society has to offer, take a scroll on their website, history.utah.gov.
I think readers were attracted to the optimism they found in her writing.
She is never wallowing in abandonment or rejection, because it's always these men leaving her. She's never leaving them. But it's not, woe is me, how shall I carry on? It's, what's the line? There's a Lizzo song. If he don't love you anymore, walk your fine ass out the door. Go get on with it. She would not tolerate any sort of self-pitying stuckedness. And then in the 1930s, she starts a fashion magazine / lifestyle magazine with her husband.
Okay.
But this is a very specific kind of lifestyle magazine.
She was brought up in an era when everyone wore kimono, not just women, but kimono was the garment of choice. And then gradually people began to wear more Western style clothing. She was very fashionable. And so in the 1920s and 30s, she was considered a modern girl. She cut her hair, which was quite scandalous. She bobbed her hair. She was kind of a flapper, so she wore Western clothes. And in the late 1930s, she and her husband created a magazine called Style. And it was all about modern style, Western garments. But, like, how do you wear a Western garment? What clothes do you wear underneath a Western garment? And, how do you do that? Dance and jazz had become very popular at the time. So the magazine introduced, how do you dance? Let's look at dance steps. And in the magazines, you can see the little footsteps, that would instruct people on the foxtrot or whatever it was. And all of this was really popular.
Wow. Which I love, filling in those holes in social knowledge.
I love it.
And again, sort of subversively introducing the idea of these like independent women in a very conservative, extremely patriarchal society through a very non-threatening medium.
But also, like, in the 1930s, as Japan is invading other nations and, becoming full totalitarian and like part of a cultural discussion about who are we and how do we dress and what do we approve of and what do we not approve of.
Yep.
Yeah, super fascinating time to be doing that.
And even that very quickly shifts, right? As they are ratcheting up the war machine, frivolous writing, frivolous clothes, Western things all become unacceptable again, right? And so she has to change. She has to change what she's writing. She has to change what she's doing.
In the 1930s, Japan was beginning its war on the continent. And so writing had to become more serious. And she had to tamp down some of the love-focused writing. So in 1942, she writes a work called A Wife's Letters, written as though a woman were addressing a man who was off to war. And in fact, Uno's husband at the time had been dispatched as a propaganda writer. So she writes this story about a wife who's patiently waiting for her man while he's off serving the nation and how glorious that is. So I think probably censors who read this thought, well, this is so patriotic. It's exactly what women need to read. It's about a woman who is waiting patiently for her man. But sort of behind the scenes, this woman who's waiting patiently is also very independent. And she's learning to live by herself, and she's learning to enjoy her own space and time. And so covertly, the story is telling us about a independently minded woman who is an individual. So it's at this point in Japanese history, I think it's very subtly subversive.
While your man is off occupying Manchuria, you could have a feminist awakening.
Yes.
Huh.
As long as you don't call it that.
At the same time, she published an interview with a maker of traditional Japanese puppets. And it also was published. This is at the time when many, many works were being censored because they weren't militaristic enough. So she's publishing these things that have nothing to do with the current sort of masculine enterprise. And I think she's getting away with some of this because people just said, oh, she's just an insignificant woman writer. So I think she was able to use her persona to allow her to continue publishing when many writers could not. But then when the war intensified, the Japanese government had an anti-extravagance campaign. And so anything Western was verboten. Women could not use permanent waves in their hair anymore. Women couldn't wear Western clothes anymore.
So obviously that's the end of style, and Uno Chiyo has to give up the magazine.
Aww.
Ha ha ha! Just kidding. Have you met her? Of course she doesn't. All you have to do is change the name of the magazine from Style to Woman's Life.
Woman's Life.
And they began to feature more traditional garments, not necessarily kimono, but the more appropriate garments for the war era. She was adaptable, but she never lost her center, right? I mean, she adapted, but didn't really compromise, if that makes sense. And once the war was over, they resumed style. But now she was interested in kimono, and she began to design very modern-esque kind of kimonos. So the patterns were bolder. Some of them looked like, is it Paul Klee or Mondrian or Cezanne or some sort of modern Western patterns. And she took her designs to Paris. She took her designs to the runway in Seattle and New York. And so even though it was a kimono for the modern time and modern girl. Then her company branched out from just marketing kimono fabric to other kinds of goods. She devised her own motif, which was of small fluttering cherry blossoms. And so cherry petals became her motif. And she begins to put this motif on teacups, on umbrellas, on towels, placemats.
This is still a famous and very popular motif. I mean, I collect teacups. I covet Uno Chiyo teacups. They're so beautiful. They're delicate and modern at the same time. This cherry blossom motif is so beautiful.
Yeah, I Googled it. I can see them. Yeah, plates and...
And again, this is her. She's refusing to be pigeonholed.
Yeah.
She is both independent and feminine and ambitious and domestic and fashion-minded.
I sometimes call her the bad girl of good housekeeping because she excelled at the domestic arts that we tend to associate with housewives. She enjoyed cooking. She was an excellent cook. She was thinking often about, what will I cook for my husband? Let me fix what he likes. And she eventually produces at least one cookbook. And the cookbook includes vignettes with each recipe. She gives little backstories about for whom she made this particular dish.
Like, oh, I made this all the time for my husband number 2. He really loved this kind of cooking. This was husband 3's favorite dish.
So it seems, very feminine and housewifey. And it is. But it also shows, again, I think her independence. She was a kimono designer, so she's a seamstress. And she's doing things that we also associate with more traditional femininity. But she then invests it with her own power.
She's taking the things that a certain kind of narrative says a liberated woman, a modern woman should be rejecting those things.
Yeah.
And she's
doing
leaning directly into them because she likes them.
Yeah, interesting. Huh.
And as myself, a passionate, committed feminist who also really loves cooking and sewing and deeply appreciates a good red lipstick, I very much appreciate her refusal to give up any of those aspects of herself. She's gonna be who she is. So she's constantly bouncing in her real life between these two identities, right? That her society says she has to choose one. She's not allowed to do both. And so she, in her life, bounces between them, right? She gets married and she's passionately in love and she's making the dinners that he wants. But the writing is pulling her again and again and again until it destroys the domestic home and she has to start over again. So, I think that's so relevant now, right? Because that narrative is still working really hard. And, we still see this today, right? If you want to fulfill a certain aesthetic or lifestyle in the dress and the heels, who bakes pies, who has babies, that you have to give up career ambition or you have to give up political interest, that you can't do both. I've had so many people tell me that I obviously am not a real feminist because I wear dresses. Or I can't be a real feminist because I bake pies. Nonsense. You can, in fact, do all the things you like without betraying any particular identity. You can bake amazing pies and have a career. You can plant a garden and be a domestic goddess and write books or teach college or design bridges or whatever it is you want to do. You don't have to do any of those things. But there is nothing intrinsically unfeminist about baking, and there is nothing intrinsically unfeminine about being an engineer. Now, from a time frame and from social pressures, is it easy to do all those things? Of course not. It's very difficult. But it's not like a moral betrayal of an identity to be a women's studies professor who likes shoes. It's okay for you to like stuff, right? Even the concept that you have to reject everything that is coded feminine, that stuff girls like is inherently stupid or shallow or useless or pointless, is part of the problem of misogyny that feminism is working to address, right? And so it's fascinating to see how it has shifted and how it has very much not shifted all at the same time. So she's writing these novels, but she is also writing through other people's voices, eyes, perspectives. But not only that, she is writing from the perspective of men. And she's actively seeking out and interviewing men so that she can write about them through their voice.
She occasionally wrote from the male persona, which is kind of unusual for women writers. Most women writers don't really write in the male voice. And she began doing this again in the 1930s. She had met a very attractive man, an artist named Togo Seiji, who had recently been in a love-suicide attempt. And he had failed. Obviously, she was interviewing him and was working on a novel that featured a suicide. And so she wanted to get his perspective. He had been in this suicide attempt that was very scandalous. He had tried to kill himself with a young woman who was the daughter of the rear admiral in the Japanese Navy. He was a celebrated artist. She was the daughter of a distinguished naval person. And so this attempted suicide made all the newspapers. And so Uno went to meet him to ask him about his experience. And according to how she describes things, she stayed with him that night. They went home to his studio.
And then she writes, "And when I woke up, I realized that we had slept in the bedding that was still caked with blood from the suicide attempt. And in that moment, I knew I had to be with him."
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. What?
Uh-huh. All right.
Yikes.
Say more? Or...
Oh, she said plenty more.
Uh-huh.
And so, it creates this really lascivious, creepy kind of scene. And it's something that I believe she manufactured to hype her scandalous nature, right? And it worked. Anyway, she stays with this man for 5 years. I believe they may have had a common law marriage, but it was a 5-year affair. And at the end of the affair, he connects back with the young woman that he had failed to die with. And they move in together, and eventually they marry. Then she writes a novel about the lead up to his failed suicide. So it's completely in his voice, and it becomes a bestseller. It's her first real masterpiece. She continues to do that throughout her career, to write from the point of view of a man. And she begins to also work in dialect and retelling stories that capture a more traditional Japan. So again, this kind of goes to that dissonance with the kimono. While she is a clearly modern, progressive woman, she's grounded in her own tradition and determined to sort of preserve and celebrate the beauty of a past that no longer exists, but now continues in her literary works.
Her women are independent and self-directed, and they do not exist as satellites to the men in their lives, emotionally or intellectually or socially, even when the story is about the predicament of women being forced to exist as satellites. These women don't. So her novels are doing really subversive work, even if the readers themselves don't realize it. In other words, these books are perfect material for an up-and-coming graduate student scholar of Japanese literature. Even if that student didn't realize it herself at the beginning.
I was at graduate school at Columbia University, and I had come to my interest in Japanese literature by reading a very popular at the time man writer named Mishima Yukio. I had attempted to write my master's thesis on Mishima, and my thesis advisor said, "Nah, it's not working. You're not getting this." I worked all summer on this thesis, and he shut it down. That semester, I was in a seminar that he was teaching on self-writing in Japanese literature, and he included works by Uno Chiyo. And so many of the writers were so pathetic, and they were so downtrodden and confessing their many grievances and how the world had done them wrong. Uno Chiyo was completely different. She was like, "Yeah, this guy broke my heart, but you know what? I just got up and walked on." And I thought, I really like her attitude and her sort of forward progression, that she doesn't let anybody hold her back. And this, for me, was refreshing, because a lot of Japanese literature is a little more subdued. And so my advisor said, "You're kind of connecting with this writer. Why don't you work on her for your master's?" And so I did. And after I had finished that, I decided to just keep working on her for the PhD. I had a different advisor for the PhD, and his name was Edward Seidensticker, a very famous translator, and he was very supportive of my work. When I first started writing my dissertation, people at different social functions or the local bar would say, "Well, who are you working on?" And I would say Uno Chiyo, and they'd be like, "Why? I mean, she's not that important. Why aren't you working on Natsume Soseki or Tanizaki Junichiro, who are very important canonical male writers?" And I was like, "No, I'm going to work on Uno Chiyo." And some, like creepy men would say, "Oh, well, are you going to live the same life she led?" And I was like, "Oh, back off, dude. Maybe I will. And what if I do?" I went to Tokyo on a Fulbright to do my dissertation research and use the archives in Tokyo. And I thought, while I'm here, I should meet her. She was still living. And that was another interesting aspect of my choice. At that time in the academic world, most people preferred that you work on writers who had passed away or long dead.
There's lots of cons to working on a living writer.
Yeah.
Firstly, that they can write new stuff that will ruin your entire thesis. But one major pro is you might be able to meet them. And she is so excited at the idea of being able to meet the subject of her dissertation and ask her these crucial fundamental questions. Ask her personally, right? Get the definitive answer.
Yeah. That's the dream of all, say, Austinites.
Oh, how much money would I give to be able to meet Edith Wharton?
So I was real excited. So when I got to Tokyo, I had an advisor in Tokyo who was helping me, a Japanese scholar. And he approached her and said, "This woman wants to meet you."
And Uno Chiyo says, absolutely not.
Huh.
It's like, why would I want to meet an American academic? No, under no circumstances.
Huh.
Crushed. Absolutely crushed. But she's not going to give up.
Then I got another famous American scholar to broach the topic with her. He had translated her works before, and he knew her, so he met her. And she said, again, no.
She gets another prominent scholar.
A third time, I had somebody intercede on my behalf. And again, 3 times, she said no. And I thought, what am I doing here? You know, she won't even meet me. What's wrong with me? Why am I so horrible? It just so happened while I was there, my husband's parents came to visit, and they had never been to Japan. So I took them on the tour of Tokyo and then Kyoto and then Hiroshima. And when we were in Hiroshima, I looked at the train schedule and I saw Iwakuni is not far from Hiroshima. And Iwakuni is where Uno Chiyo was born, and she spent her early life there. And many of her stories are set in Iwakuni. And my husband said, just go. You don't have to babysit my parents all this time. Just go on your own. So I went down to Iwakuni and I visited the places that she wrote about. And when I got back to Tokyo, I wrote this long letter to her. I saw the bridge that you write about. I saw your house, and I imagined you there with your father. And I reiterated scenes from her stories back to her. And then I had it proofed with my Japanese instructor and wrote it out in hand, which is what you do back then, and then mailed it to her with high hopes. And within a day of having mailed it, I got a phone call from her secretary saying, Uno Chiyo will meet you.
Yay.
This is sort of a royal summons.
Mm.
She will meet you. You will come.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I went and personally met her, and we had a very nice interview. And so I was able to incorporate that eventually in my dissertation. I think the concept of a woman who was doing research on her felt so foreboding. Like, what was I going to do? Go in there and put her under a microscope, you know? But once she met me, she realized I wasn't really very intimidating, and she was very sweet. She was published in really mainstream journals. She wasn't just shunted off into specialized journals or women's journals. I mean, she had a presence there as well, but she trafficked in the mainstream and was recognized by some mainstream awards and things like that.
And the way she responds to this is fascinating to me, and I think really revealing.
She would say, well, I just wrote down what he said. It wasn't really my construction. By doing that, she nods towards the authenticity of the voice, right? It's not my construction. It's authentic. It's his. And so that gives perhaps the voice more clout in the literary world where she was working. It's also, I think, an inherent modesty, cultural modesty, of tossing off any kind of compliment, you know, oh, no, 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 I just wrote what he said. And it goes to the persona that she's created, right? I'm not really an artist. I'm just a scandalous woman.
And for all these various reasons, it's important to her that she not accept what we would now frame as like proper credit, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that identity and that framing allows her to do some incredibly influential and subversive work undercover.
She had an essay that she wrote in I think it was published in 1935 or 36. In English, the translated title is The Genius of Imitation. And she claims that When I decided I wanted to become a writer, I didn't know how to write. And so I read the works of Strindberg and Balzac, and I decided I'm writing like them. I decided I wanted to write like Tamara Toshiko, so I'm writing like her. And of course, she writes nothing like them. And then she claims, when I married my husband, and this is her second husband, he too was a writer. My husband and I put our desks together, and I would write something and I would turn to him and say, "Darling, what do you think?" And when my vision matched his, then I knew it was good. And so she writes this whole essay about how she's not really responsible for her craft. She writes, "It was as though I were learning how to put on a costume. I learned how to put on a costume very well." And again, the entire essay is a conceit because the essay on imitation is itself an original, right? And so even though she's saying, "Oh, look at me, I'm wearing this mask," she's showing us that she's wearing a mask. And so by doing so, she's alerting us to the face behind the mask. So she's very clever in deflecting her talent in that way. So I think that's what made her safe, but in reality, she was using that to write her own story.
Last summer, I went to a Waylon Jennings concert, and
Lucky.
I remember one of them saying, when she was introducing one of her songs, and she said, "My songs are always way smarter than I am." And I guess it stuck with me. Maybe it's the same thing with Uno Chiyo. It's like, what you channel can be way deeper and smarter than you are.
Yeah.
And you can go, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I just wrote the stuff down. It comes from some deeper well.
Yeah.
What's also interesting, and this kind of goes back to the bad girl of Good Housekeeping, in the 1960s, I think, after her third and last husband divorced her, everybody, I guess, expected, she's now in her 70s. So everybody says, "Oh, life's over for her. How tragic." Of course it wasn't. She wrote a piece about her experiences with this breakup. And one of the scenes that she creates in the story is the man is leaving. He's walking out the door and she is watching him leave. And she thinks, what does he need? How can I help him? So instead of boo-hooing her tragic situation, she's trying to be positive and moving forward. And I think when other people read that novel, they felt sort of the positivity of her attitude.
That piece was so popular, she was offered a job as an advice columnist. And her responses
Good idea.
to these letters are fascinating. In a society that firmly regarded being discarded by a man as the biggest catastrophe that could ever befall a woman, and that worked really hard to make sure that was true, that it was financially and socially and in every way the biggest catastrophe that could befall a woman, Uno Chiyo's response was,
"Get your hair done, put on your best kimono, and walk down the main avenue." She wouldn't have anything of this sort of self-pitying. That's what made her so attractive. She says, "I always look forward. I never look backward. I'm always moving forward."
and that spirit of belief in her own ability and other women's ability to get through it and to not just survive, but to thrive without a man's approval or attention or ownership is revolutionary.
Something that I continue to also appreciate as I get older is that she found beauty in her aging body. Uno Chiyo never disappointed. She never stopped loving herself. She has a story that she wrote when she was in her 70s, and it opens with, I'm paraphrasing, "I look like her. I look like her, she thought, as she stood before the foggy bathroom mirror, holding her towel and turning her hips just so. She imagined she looked like Botticelli's Venus. The fact that her eyesight was failing and the mirror was fogged only contributed to the impression, or something like that. So she's 70 years old and she's seeing in her body something beautiful. She lived to be 99. I think it was 99, maybe 98, but quite old. And she celebrated her 88th birthday. 88 is an important birthday in Japanese culture. And so there was a big birthday celebration for her at the Imperial Hotel with lots of dignitaries.
Throughout this event, she had 3 separate costume changes.
And each time she changed her kimono to a different kimono of her design. And the kimono that she wore had long dangly sleeves, which that style of kimono is usually limited only to young girls. It's a very youthful kimono.
On her 88th birthday, she says, "I'm not giving in to the social expectation or narrative of what an old woman is.
I am an old woman, but I'm still living my life."
She really wanted to make it to 100, and she didn't quite make it. She died when she was 98 years old.
Aw.
She's not well known today. And I mean, that's just the way it is. We forget about the people that came before and made it happen for us.
But it seems interest may be reviving.
I translated one of her self-referential novels in 1992, I think, and it has just been re-released just this year.
So maybe she's coming back. But she was genuinely celebrated and appreciated in her life, which is wonderful. You know, so often in this podcast, our stories are, and now she's finally getting the attention she deserved 100 years after her death.
Yeah.
But Uno Chiyo got it, and she enjoyed it. She loved herself, and she loved her work, and she was happy in the life she made for herself.
What she leaves behind is really these so subtle and universal truths. She had a saying, I can't reproduce it exactly, but she says, "The person you see today is just the tip of the iceberg. Your real self is deep, deep beneath the surface. You're more than what people see. There's more to you. And you are responsible for mining that within you, not just stopping at the surface." So it's not, I mean, she wasn't a philosopher. She didn't go around teaching people things, but this is sort of what she leaves behind in her writing.
I think she very much was a philosopher, doing very, very accessible philosophy for the masses in a way that, you know, maybe even she didn't recognize, but made it possible for people to access it without having to worry about, oh no, I'm going to be asked to do some deep work. I'm just reading a sexy story that's going to secretly change my life.
We all suffer the slings and arrows of romance and fate, and life doesn't always turn out how we expected. But I hear her telling me, just put on your best kimono, do your hair, and walk out the front door. And I'm like, okay, I'll just keep moving on.
Thanks so much to our guest, Rebecca Copeland. On our website at What'sHerNamePodcast.com, you'll find links and photos, including some beautiful pictures of Rebecca and Uno Chiyo together, and some of Chiyo's beautiful cherry blossom designs.
You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook, where we post lots of photos each week.
Music for this episode was provided by Hirano Aiko, Jack9, Zac Zinger, Doug Maxwell, the Mini Vandals, Bounce Bay Records, and Kumi.
Our theme song was composed and performed by Daniel Foster Smith.
Our intern is Katie Boucher. What's Her Name is produced by Olivia Mickle and Katie Nelson, and this episode was produced by Olivia Mickle.